Sheffield street tree inquiry. Could I ask you please to tell us your name and your role?
Morning, my name is Eugene. I'm Executive Director of Resources at the City Council currently.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it. I just have a few things that I'm running through with everybody at the beginning. So once again, I thank you for coming and talking to us for this conversation. We are recording the conversation, and it will be broadcast and available for people to view online afterwards. So I just want to make sure you understand that, and that's jolly good. Also, just to say that obviously what we're dealing with in investigating what happened during the dispute is some issues which were stressful and emotive for a number of people, and we know that there were quite high feelings at various points in the dispute. What we're doing in this set of conversations is having conversations in a cordial, constructive way where we need to make sure we're not defaming or libeling anybody, or we're not breaking any confidences in terms of bringing names of people into the public domain which is not already in the public domain, and so infringing their privacy rights. If at any point, which I'm not expecting, I am concerned that we're maybe crossing a line on that, I will flag to you I'm concerned about that, and in extreme circumstances, if I were to become deeply concerned about that, then we would have to pause the hearing. That's something I'm saying to everybody, and I'm not expecting it to arise, but I just want to be clear what would happen in those circumstances. So I'm expecting that all these conversations will be constructive and will be a discussion between the two of us. We've sent you a list of topics I'd like to discuss with you, and essentially what we'll do, Eugene, is work our way through those. But I would like to give you the chance before we get into those of saying anything you'd like to say at the beginning.
No, nothing specific around just to reinforce what you said. I think, and that's one of the reasons I want to come on today. I think it's positive that you're approaching this in a kind of spirit of reconciliation and trying to do learning from it. And I think that's exactly the right approach, and I'm happy to contribute to that.
Perfect, thank you so much. So I know you've worked for the council for a long time, and I just wonder if you could list for us the roles you've had since 2005 and any responsibilities you had at various points for things directly relevant to the Streets Ahead contract.
Sure. So I actually started at the council in 1998 as Deputy Director of Finance, so I held that post in 2005. I became Director of Finance at some point around 2018 when all the finance teams across the council were put together, because previously they'd been devolved because there weren't many councils. At that point, I was not the statutory, it's Section 151 officer, the Chief Financial Officer. That position was undertaken by the person who was Executive Director of Resources at the time. I was Deputy Chief Financial Officer, even though I was Director of Finance. And then actually in 2014, I, on a temporary basis to start with, took up the role of Executive Director of Resources and became Chief Financial Officer at that time. 2 years temporarily and then permanently, I think, from around 2016. And that's the post I've occupied since. That post, it is Chief Financial Officer, but I then had wider responsibility for basically most of the corporate support services in the council, so that included the legal team, HR team, IT, etc. So in that sense, I was responsible for the teams, some of which gave close support to the project in its genesis and then throughout the period of the dispute and reconciliation.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. That's great. So I'd like to ask you if you could describe for us your understanding of the state of the roads and the pavements and the street lighting and the street trees in Sheffield, firstly in around 2010, before the project started, and then how things are now.
Yeah, I think it's incomparable, and actually I think it's one of the interesting things about this situation, because in my time through the 2000s, and when we were always having discussion with budgets about discussion or performance, the state of the highways was a massive, I would say, probably the biggest issue in the city. city for both parties, a bone of contention that there must be some kind of solution. So it had considerable impetus. And I think, well, it does well to remember that because it's interesting. This is always the trouble with services like highways. It was a huge issue. When you fix something like that, people don't notice. No one drives along the road, I always say, and goes, Mike, what a smooth road. I think I'll write to the council and tell them what a good job they're doing. People don't notice when the streetlights are working. They notice when one is out. And the performance around all those things, largely because of budget cuts, was pretty terrible. And that's evidence from performance indicators and levels of satisfaction. And I can say personally, I've cycled to work for years. I used to joke about the fact that actually you needed a mountain bike to cycle to work in Sheffield, whereas now there are issues with the contract around performance and bits, but actually this is what's difficult. When someone sees a bottle, they'll write the complaint, that's fine. But the level and the standard of roads is incomparable. And as a cyclist, I can attest to that because you don't have the same problem dropping into potholes, and I can ride my road bike much more easily than I used to be able to do. And so I think that's it is interesting context, and also not just the roads, but we now have amazing lighting in the city, LED based, that doesn't provide loads of light pollution compared to things that were, people remember, they're almost antique street lighting before then, and also obviously the pavements as well. So there is no comparison, and that's again attested by current performance indicators and levels of satisfaction when they're measured objectively.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the council let the contract to Amy in 2012, and there's quite a complex financial structure for it, I think it's fair to say. And so I wanted to spend a bit of time with you just going through some elements of that. And there's basically three broad questions I'd like to go through with you. The first one is what the council is due to pay Amy for the contract and the way those payments are made. So there's a mixture of capital in the early stages, and then there's the unitary charge, which I'd like to go through that. The second question is where the council obtains the funds which it needs to meet those payments. And then the third question is how the finances work from Amy's perspective. In other words, they needed at the beginning to seek investors, and they needed also to borrow some money, and so they had some lenders, and there were implications of that. So could we spend a few minutes, please, just going through those three questions?
I'll do that, and I'll refer to them because it is complex, and I think worth spending some time as context for the contract. So, and also perhaps explain generally just kind of a little bit about how PFIs work. I mean, we are not unusual in having a PFI contract, but we have a particularly large one and complex one in a highways PFI contract. I think there are only two others in the country, one of which is subsequently been terminated. But we also have a number of school PFIs. There's the school estates, secondary schools in Sheffield was particularly done up through PFI arrangements. And it's complex. It was also worth saying a mechanism very much of its era, which coloured quite a lot of it. So during the period of investment in schools and that period of central government, PFI was the mechanism by which a lot of capital investment was done. And there was quite a sense of, if you were going to have capital investment support from governments, PFI was the only game in town. There was meant to be a kind of business case assessment about kind of comparing it to traditional procurement, but actually in practice, government rules skewed it towards a PFI. And in simple terms, given the state of the roads in Sheffield and the impetus from all political parties to do something about it, Sheffield was really keen on doing that, and the only way to access investments was through a PFI contract. We would not have got government support without it, and we got a lot of government support. So that kind of coloured a lot of the impetus around, because the project was a lot of years in gestation. It was a very complex procurement process. So that background. So and there's some of the reasons why we ended up with it. There is less emphasis on that now, and we actually have more freedom to borrow more traditionally. wouldn't have brought government support. That's the other thing. If we borrow now for capital projects, we're largely on our own. So it did unhook. Out of the about 2 billion investment, around half of it is from government grants and still is. And that's great that we got that investment in the city we would have either got. Although it does tie our hands slightly now without flexibility on things. So what that led to us, as with most PFI contracts, a 25-year arrangement. All PFI arrangements are largely an upfront investment, be that building a school, in this case refurbishing a significant level of capital investment to bring the highways up to a certain standard, a defined standard. And that involved several £100 million borrowing as a key part of the contract. All PFIs then have that 25-year life cycle maintenance that keeps the asset at a certain standard, and it always comes with the need to effectively outsource the maintenance support for those, be that the maintenance of the school, or in this case, the maintenance of the highways. So that is, and that's the core of the contract, and that debt is a huge part of it, and the mechanism. And a lot of what government was obviously doing at the time was keeping public sector borrowing off the balance sheet. That was the intent, not ours. It was on our balance sheet. It was driven by the Majesty's Treasury desire to keep things off the balance sheet, and on that basis we get investment. So that meant we had a contract where there's a core investment period, first 5 years, where there's that significant level of investment, which is when the dispute started to happen, and that rolled out to bring that up to standard. And that time limited period, I think, was part of the context for the dispute. That then led on to the period we now on, after that core investment, where the contractor is responsible for maintaining the highways to the standard that's been done. As in all PFI contracts, there's a payment mechanism that incentivises that performance and deducts the contractor if they do not comply. That payment mechanism is necessarily complicated across a 25-year contract, but obviously one of the issues always is as well, having a contract to go across that length of period of time is difficult in itself, and contract variations become difficult over that period of time as circumstances change, as they have. There are some key elements in a PFI contract around the risk allocation between the councillor's client and the contractor. Again, a lot of them stipulated by government rules. Effectively, the government wants risk transferring to the provider, not with the council, so that as part of the transfer of risk and the test around the borrowing being off balance sheet. And that is a significant issue in kind of when we try and change the contract. And it leads therefore as well to some, when we get into issues around what's happening with the contract and performance deductions and questions people sometimes ask about, can we end the contract, can we terminate it, very restricted from the point of view of the way that's all set up. And not least because the government money would be an issue, but also because any termination or changes are something that the central government is interested in. We do not have the freedom to do that. That's not just because that's all PFI contracts across the country. So there's a considerable amount of monitoring about them through the whole. So sorry, just with that context. So in that context, what we have is significant upfront investment by Amy with borrowing from banks for a key part of the contract for around 400 million.
Yeah.
That is then repaid over that 25 years, and there is something called a unitary charge every year that we pay to a special purpose vehicle that is set up to do that. In the current year, to give an example, those payments are around 66 million. That is massively above the amount we spent on highways before. That is broken down to be partly the repayment of that upfront debt. So in the current year, 2022, that's about 26 million of debt repayment. So that's about 40%, roughly. There is then payment to Amy as the local contractor of that special purpose vehicle that's set up for debt purposes. So there's a subcontracting arrangement to Amy. Again, that's around 40%, which is running the services that were previously part of the council, doing the maintenance of the people you see out on the roads. And then another important element of the contract, back to that core investment, and then there's a requirement to keep it to standard. Around 20% of the remaining amount is for that life cycle maintenance that Amy are required to do to keep it to that. So that's the basis of it. Significant payment every year, broken down between debt hopefully that explains kind of the way the payments work. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's helpful. And so just to be clear, we're still on my first bit of the question there, which is... No, that's good. This is very helpful. So this is all about what the council's due to pay Amy and the way those payments are made. And as you've said, Amy had to borrow a lot of money at the beginning. The council... was the council borrowing at the beginning as well?
Technically in PFIs, no. The whole idea is that they're completely private sector equity. But what happened in later PFI deals, including ours, and this is always slightly bizarre, the government realised that private sector borrowing was more expensive than the council borrowing through the public sector means. So in a number of later PFI deals, including ours, and this complicated it further, there was an element of the council borrowing in 235 million. So the 400 million was partly made up. And I think that figure, in my recollection, came from the fact that the Treasury decided that it was okay to have a certain amount of borrowing as public sector. Again, tied in presumably with their test of whether it was on the public sector balance sheet. So if it had been more than 50%, the statisticians in further up in the, I mean, it's not just the UK statistical authorities.
Yes, there's a global set of standards.
Would have kind of gone, aha, it's more than 50% public borrowing. It needs to be on the government's public sector borrowing requirement.
Yeah.
But to make the contract cheaper over the period, because obviously repaying debt over 25 years like a mortgage is expensive, and there's an element of public sector debt in there where we borrowed directly and put that into the arrangement. And
the central government allowed the city to do that borrowing?
Yes, it was dictated by how much the government would allow. If we'd have been allowed to do 100% borrowing, it would have been even cheaper, but we weren't allowed to.
Yes, okay, very good, that's helpful. So the next question becomes, so where does the council get the money to effectively to pay the unitary charge from which Amy do those three things? They service the debt, they provide the services, and they build up a fund from which they spend to maintain the assets in the standard which they're required to be maintained.
So, I mean, over the 25 years, it's just over £2 billion. It's a huge contract, and it is broadly split. Slightly more to government, but 50-50 between PFI credits, as it's called, which is basically government grant, and £1 billion of council budgets, which was a combination of the existing amount we spent on highways, but because that was insufficient and this was all part of the negotiation with government, we had to do a significant uplift in how much we spent annually on highways, partly because the budget had been very low due to previous periods of austerity. And then that's baked in. We are committed to doing that. The unitary payment is fixed. Well, it goes up by inflation. There's a schedule that exists now about how much we will pay through the 25 years. There's a commitment from government to that and to us. So that varies over time with the retail price index increasing the contract. But again, to use the 2022 figures, just for illustration, there's actually in the current year 48 million from government. Out of the 66 million we're paying, 20 million from Sheffield City Council. So the balance changes over time. There are also some retained elements of the contract, client cost, etc., that is with the council and things like electricity costs, but that's the broad split.
So could you just explain in a little bit more detail, that's incredibly helpful what you said, but explain a little bit more detail, that 20 million that the council has to find itself, where do you get that money from?
Thank you. So from the council's overall budget, and therefore in competition, if you like, with other elements, and that means it's financed from, well, originally it would have been financed from general government grant, but since 2010 government's cut most of it, and we are effectively left to have local income only to fund that, which is, as people will know, council tax, which has had to go up because of government cuts, business rates, but they are fixed by inflation and a fairly fixed level of income and have not risen to the same extent. And the other thing that is in our control that we've obviously is things like fees and charges. So, for example, no one likes paying parking fees, but that goes back into the budgets that help fund it. So a combination of council tax,
business rates, the element we keep, because obviously some of that goes to government, and fees and charges. You probably want to talk about this a little bit more, but since 2010, obviously there have been a lot of constraints on that funding compared to what is a fixed and big investment in highways. And that's, again, part of the context of the budget, perhaps.
So maybe tell us a little bit more now about that. The fact you had to find this 20 million or so a year in a tight financial environment. What were the sort of consequences of that?
Well, it's interesting because the timing of, as I said, the genesis of the project was significant. I forget exactly when it started, but it will have been back in 2007, 2008, and it took a long time. It originally started under the Labour government, running through to and then the change of government in 2010 kind of came at a point where we were very committed to following through on the project. Everyone was behind it, but austerity started to happen. And then what has happened since is, I mean, fairly well publicised figures for all local councils, but particularly Northern Metropolitan Councils. Basically the government has stripped grant support, apart from the specific grants such as the PFI, but the general government grant we used to get has basically disappeared. So income from central government, we still get business rates effectively, it's redistributed nationally, but we have lost half our funding from, in overall terms in the period between 2010 and now. That's not just us, it's all councils, that's quite well publicised. We've partly made that up by increasing council tax and fees, but if you look at our budget, there's about a third less money than there was 12 years ago, and that's in cash terms. So compared to the rest of the public sector, when people talk about public sector reductions, there's no comparison between what's happened to councils and central government, universities and other parts. It's had a massive impact. And the other thing I think is there's an increasing awareness of, during that time, social care budgets alongside health has been a massive increase in demand, and we have for the last 8-9 years increased both children's and adult social care budgets significantly, 5, 6, 7% a year, just to cope with the demand pressures. So there's a kind of tsunami of issues there where we let the contract at a time where everybody was really clear we need to spend more on highways. We did, we were committed to it. Austerity happens nationally, massive cuts, the extra squeeze of social care budgets, and we can't change. We can. There have been some contract variations we can talk about, but very limited flexibility to save money on a £66 million payment a year. So what's happened is there are a number of other budgets in the council, largely again around a lot of things people see day to day, social care, around the environment, etc., where there's been a massive squeeze on a smaller and smaller part of the budget, and a kind of therefore a big impact there. And it's no exaggeration to say that squeeze and that consciousness of the difficulty that's causing and the impact of cuts elsewhere in the council is something that's very much, I think, on the mind of people who are making decisions about what we were doing with the contract. There's been a huge commitment to it, little flexibility to change it, but everybody wanted it to happen. Social care costs increasing, and people obviously concerned about vulnerable people, adults and children. And some difficult decisions, therefore, about kind of how much within the flexibility you had got to change the highways contract, whether it was possible to do it in that context of those funding constraints. And that kind of did dictate quite a lot of the context of decision making, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, you've touched on this. Actually, no, one more thing on the financing. I think we just better ask you a little bit about how the finances work from Amy's perspective, including their need to seek investors and lenders, and just talk us through the fact that at the beginning, from Amy's point of view, their lenders would see a certain level of risk, and then as time passed, they may have seen a different level of risk, and that created opportunities which were taken up through, as well come on to contract variation. Just talk me through that a little bit.
Okay, so I think as I said, the debt is a key element of a PFI contract. It's a means of borrowing with wraparound services put into the contract, but it is the core of it. And therefore, actually, in any PFI deal, one of the most influential element is the banks. Right. There's the funders, and it's interesting if and when you get to look at things like that, if Amy's performance is ever not what it needs to be, they are effectively a subcontractor to this deal. And if they did not perform, it wouldn't be about Amy dissolved and gone. The banks would step in, because the debt dictates the overall terms of the contract, and would replace them with another contractor. The deal wouldn't end. And I'm not sure that's completely understood by a lot of people. And that's not our PFI deal. That is how PFIs work. So the banks are hugely important. And there was, Amy raising significant, 400 million of investment is not that easy to do. So yes, consortium of banks at the start is not unusually in PFI contracts. There's usually a consortium about the risk sharing, because you're right, there is a substantial amount of risk, particularly in that initial construction, or in our case, core investment period around delivery. And what usually happens in PFI contracts is that there tends to be a consortium of banks involved at that stage who are prepared to take that risk, and as ever, that risk requires an increased reward for the banks, so the interest rate tends to be higher. When the government started doing PFI deals, they kind of realised this, and it became standard after a few years, and it was in our contract, that there are clauses in there that after that initial investment period, there's a prescribed process for what's called a refinancing, which basically usually involves those banks who've taken that risk, stepping out at that point, taking the reward, some kind of competition to bring in other banks who have got a safer investment, because after the initial period, the PFI is an income source for them. There's a unitary charge, fairly certain, going up by inflation. They can put money in and refinance instead of the original banks. They can offer a lower interest rate, and there's a saving from that, come back to that, and in return they get a more assured payment mechanism, and that's the period we're in now, and that's again standard in PFI contracts, and the government prescribes a lot about how that works, because they are a party to that cost with us. They're paying half of this, so whenever we get into those arrangements, it's a process we have to go through, not just with Department for Transport, but up to the Her Majesty's Treasury. And there's usually in the contract a specified mechanism for how the saving is shared. So basically, the Chancellor Exchequer gets some of the money back, as well as us. Does that explain?
Yeah, so basically, when the refinancing happens, the government have become savvy enough not to let the private sector take all the benefit.
Yeah.
It's written into the contract, the benefit will be shared between Amy, effectively, and the government, and the government's share is split between central government and the city, and that's all written into the contract.
That's correct, yeah.
Right, very good, thank you. Now, that deals with part of what I wanted to ask you about in respect of the role of central government in the contract. But are there other things that you want to tell us about the role of central government in the contract and your involvement in any discussions with them, either in the 2016 to 18 period or subsequently to that?
Yeah, I think generally I've talked about it. The significant size of the contract, and big amongst local authority PFI contracts, the bigger national ones obviously, but and the complexity of it, and the fact that a lot of that was dictated by government. They're putting a lot of money in. It's not unreasonable. But and the lack of room for manoeuvre independently that gives us, I think, is a key feature I've probably talked about quite a lot. That, and particularly a kind of obsession with the risk transfer element, where if it got into the risk transfer changing too much, and we got into this around some of the issues around the payment performance mechanism. So in various periods where Amy have not performed, they racked up substantial performance deductions. Now, normally when you have a contract like that, you enter into a commercial negotiation with your contractor and go, well, how's this working? Is the contract mechanism appropriate? No contract can provide for all circumstances. So sometimes as a client, you go, well, actually the right thing to do here is to change the contract, and we give you this and we give you that. That doesn't happen nowhere near as simply as a normal contract, because the government sat at the table. And in various instances, the government sat at the table. Their interest is nothing to do with what's actually happening with the contract or what's happening on the streets of Sheffield. They're just obsessed about what it means for the public sector borrowing requirements and whether the debt will get up on the government's balance sheet. So I was involved in some very esoteric discussions at one point with some statisticians in Treasury. It was bizarre. Trying to have a conversation about what we were trying to achieve in the city and the importance of making some savings on the contract through the performance mechanism and the refinancing. And it's not a concern at all. It was all to do with what it would do to the mechanisms of the contract. So that kind of made that quite complex. Now, and in any PFI deal, and people involved in schools will know this, any 25-year contract as well is innately hard to change. You can't think of every circumstance in year 1 that happened even in year 5 or year 10, never mind 25. And once you're in a position where you've got banks involved, the government, and one contractor, any contract variation is a difficult process. To protect all the parties, it gets written into huge tomes of contracts, but the very fact that it has to get written down is a complexity in itself. There's protection for people, but it means it's a very tortuous process. And we have been through several. I wasn't involved in too many of them. There've been 6 since 2016.
Okay, so let's go through one by one, each of them, and I may have 1 or 2 questions as we go through one by one. But give us the first one that was done.
The first
one
one
was let in 2012.
Yeah.
The first variation was
2016,
right,
which is linked to the refinancing point. So
right,
after that period of time, a long way through the core investment period, you can start to look at refinancing. And by that time, obviously, austerity was 6 years into biting, and there was a considerable impetus about making a saving on the contract through refinancing. Ultimately, that proved disappointing. I remember at one time we were hoping to get a couple of million out of it, but the restrictions I've talked about meant that actually, for various reasons, it didn't save that amount. It saved 645,000 at the time. A year. Still a significant amount.
Yeah.
But in the context of what we were dealing with in budget reductions, and on the 66 million contract,
yeah, no, indeed.
it's yeah. So I was involved in some of the discussions around that refinancing and the way that was done. There were also some things I wasn't involved in around. There were some output specification changes on street lighting and snow wardens and minor things. But that was the first time one of those was done.
Yeah. So my understanding is that first variation was completed in December 2016. Do you know something different?
I don't know anything different. No.
Okay.
No.
And that, for other things I'm looking into, is relevant. And it was, as you say, it was mostly a refinancing change, but there were other things built into that variation as well. So that's great. So that was the first one. Then,
again, budget driven. Wasn't involved in this because it was largely client. It was a service based. Changed some reductions in street cleansing and ground maintenance requirements. Again, it'll be a budget related saving in 2019 of a fairly similar 660,000 saving.
Okay. And the next one?
Year after 2020, there were some minor changes to energy costs, which are a retained client. We keep a lot of the risk on electricity costs.
Okay, very good. That's 3. Then we've got...
unfortunately at the moment. 2021, 330,000. Again, I don't really understand. A lot of this was around some changes to some customer experience, the customer interface, and some things about defects. There was, according to this now, the revised approach to street trees and retaining them was built in at that point in time.
Right, so I'm looking into that, but it's worth us noting, as you just said, that it was in 2021 that elements of the agreement on a different approach to the street trees, which were reached through the mediation in 2018, it was in 2021 that they became baked into the contract.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. And then...
and same year, there was something that had been tried before, which is what we were referring to about, I can't recall exactly when I was in that strange discussion with the statisticians in the Treasury, but we had been trying to change the payment mechanism because of the level of deductions for AMI, some of which were inappropriate, and so there was the biggest saving, 1.7 million, by changing the payment mechanism where basically we took out some of the things that penalised Amy that weren't appropriate and got a significant ongoing saving of 1.7 million a year in return.
And when was that one completed?
2021.
And that was the last variation?
No, there's one down as 2022, which is another refinancing of 651.
Okay. So just on the 2021 one, my understanding is that the 2021 one, which basically you got a significant saving from, that involved making non-trivial reductions effectively to what Amy had to do, which has potentially meaningful consequences for the rest of the contract. You basically gave up some rights you had over Amy in exchange for a significant reduction in the... Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. That's great. That's super helpful. Thank you. Right, now...
I think it's worth saying, my recollection of those performance deductions, as I said, you've got a really complex contract here.
Yeah.
The payment mechanism is hugely complex.
Yes.
And probably too complex in some areas.
Yes.
And I would say some of the discussions we were having was a bit about a refinement of that payment mechanism to recognise some realities several years into the contract about what it was we wanted. This is the difficulty about an output specification. You try and define at point 1 for the future.
So if I understood what you just said there, it's essentially that the complexity and arguably the over-specification and over-complexity of the contract itself created challenges when the council wanted to adopt a slightly different approach to some things. Is that a fair summary of what you said?
I think that's an issue for all PFI contracts, but I think we have a particularly complex payment mechanism. Bearing in mind that things like school contracts became much more standard.
Yeah.
There weren't many contracts of this nature in local government. Yes.
Very good. So, bringing all this together a little bit, I wanted to ask you if you could give us a sort of high-level strategic assessment, if you like, of how all these structural features of the contract may have impacted on the dispute, effectively.
Yeah, I've covered some of it, but it's interesting reflecting on it as well. That context of a complex contract, a huge investment that there was a lot invested in the city, a lot of political impetus, both political parties at the time needed something must be done. A lot of public expectations around that, dealing with Pothole City, a lot of media expectations is part of the context, and as we've talked about, the fact that changing the contract is not easy. And I think, in fact, I recall when we started getting into a dispute, there was quite a lot of conversations about, back to what we said about that 5-year investment period, where there's a lot of risk. Banks are bothered about that, Amy are bothered about that, the price of the contract is higher. There was a lot of sense of, because the context of everybody wanting to change it, that complexity, the level of risk, that we needed to get the upgrade to the standard done within the core investment period of 5 years. And if you like, quite a lot of head of steam around that, and a sense that we needed to do that investment. And I think that was a considerable part of why, if you like, from a council point of view, we ploughed on with doing that investment, because it was seen as important. We just got so much invested in the contract, complex contract, and I fear that if we changed it and varied it, as I said, we didn't vary it, took quite a lot, a year later, the whole risk transfer issue would have got very difficult. I do recall conversations where, because back to the output nature, we were paying Amy over a period of time to bring it up to standard, and then to keep it to that standard. If we'd have pulled things out of the contract and gone, oh, okay, don't do that tree, leave that tree out, the feeling at the time was that would cause a huge issue about, well, Amy would go, well, okay, well, we're not taking the risk on that tree, because that's not, we need to maintain things to that standard, and you need to take responsibility for that tree and that back, because you're making that decision, councillor, and the risk's back on you. Now, bear in mind we've invested such a huge amount, and by this time austerity is also impacting. I think there's a great fear that if we did that, we would end up with even more costs back on ourselves that would be difficult to cope with in the wider context of the budget we're talking about. And I think that was a considerable part of what was in people's minds at the time. Is that?
Yes, and obviously one of the things I will look at is the extent to which those kind of worries were fully justified, or whether in fact there were other things that could have been done earlier. I'm not asking you about that, but that is something I will explore further, including with other people. Can I just ask you whether there's anything beyond what you've already said, because you said quite a bit about this already, but whether there's anything else beyond what you've said in terms of the way financial pressures facing the council since 2010 might have affected the handling of the dispute. As I say, you've touched on quite a bit of that, but is there anything else you want to tell us about that?
It might just be worth contextualising. I think I've said already, social care, there have been huge pressures on that, and as in most councils, it's gone up from something around 40% of our net spending to well over 50%. That's fairly standard. Of the parts that are left, what was at the time the place portfolio, which included the transport, as well as highways, of the budget in that area, I've got the exact numbers in my head, but there's a net budget of something like 120 million. You've got a huge payment to Amy. We've got an outsourced waste contract, which actually itself has elements to the PFI, links to the investment that's made in the incinerator, which again is therefore pretty fixed. And the third big cost in that area is with the payments we make to the Passenger Transport Authority, because although they run the buses, well, they don't run the buses, they're private, but the money to fund the bus network and the concessions is a levy that's shared with all the other four councils. So what you've got out of that element of some really important budgets about delivering planning, regeneration and other city centre activities are three big lumps of fairly inflexible contract. And a constant refrain in recent years is that means that whenever we've got cuts to make, which are not insignificant, tens of millions a year, the little bit of the budget you've got to play with that's not squeezed by social care, all those three big contracts, is about 20-25 million. It's next to nothing in the context of a net budget for the council of over 400 million. So I think that's probably more specifically describing the kind of squeeze on people about the lack of other choices they got to go, okay, well, we can fundamentally change this then.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you very much indeed. So I want to move on to some different topics now. I wonder if you could, I think you're a good person for me to ask this question because you've been in the council a long time and you understand the structures and who is who and the ways in which things got decided. Could you just give us a description of the sort of main decision makers in the council, both in terms of the officers but also in terms of members, in respect of the dispute between 2016 and 2018?
So the way the council works, especially once we're in a contract, is that because in the council's constitution there are certain decisions that, and there's quite a prescribed mechanism about what needs to be taken as a public decision, either that be a full cabinet at the time as it was, committee now, or at the time what would be defined as delegated decisions. And there's a pretty strict, and it's a public document written about the rules around that way that happens, not dissimilar to most councils. And then a number of delegated decisions that would either be defined as being retained by members, so at the time that would be an individual cabinet member decision. Those decisions, as well as full cabinet, are public decisions. They're published, they're on the website, people can see them. And then some decisions that are taken by officers, more day-to-day ones. Again, some of those are kind of published decisions, but a lot of those are largely not. They're in the internal management arrangements. And when you're into the operation of the contract, decisions are largely delegated within those rules. So And the lead for that would generally be the executive director of the portfolio, the director of the service, transport and highways, and then going down the hierarchy, the contract manager for the contract. And obviously that would follow what people recognise as a fairly normal management principle about what are the rules around that, the size of the decision, the impact of it, but also that kind of basis of, in any hierarchical organisation, about things get pushed up the chain when they're risky and people need to know. And that would follow through to, at various points, a decision would go to the cabinet member for transport at the time. I think when things got particularly difficult, that's when you then involve the chief executive and the leader of the council as well. That's how it worked for us. I think that's kind of what you'd expect in all local authorities have got that kind of cabinet system.
And the implication is that other parts of the council, including potentially other quite senior officers who weren't in that direct hierarchy, may not have had much sight or involvement in what was going on. Have I understood that correctly from what you said?
To some extent, yes, because those decisions are delegated and those officers are responsible. There are mechanisms within the processes. So, for example, when a decision is taken that's got financial or legal or equality impact assessments, the process in the council, and it still exists now, you can see it on committee reports, is that they're signed off by an officer within each of those teams. So the teams I run would have been involved in advising and giving formal advice and a kind of written sign-off of any legal and financial implications. But when that's part of a kind of seen as part of the operation of the contract, that would pretty much happen by bilateral relationships rather than, say, through a formal board or things like that. That's the way most of those work.
Yeah.
So there are checks and balances in there, and it's run according to a framework of decision rules. But yes, there are a number of things, because this, along with other things, the council's a huge business. There are various, if you like, compartmentalised elements where people get on with delivering things, and things would only come to a more kind of corporate overview for them if something brings them there or there's a reason for doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that would happen, obviously, there are management teams in the council that I'm part of, the executive management team at the time, chief executive, executive directors. As I said, I recall discussions during that period around what was happening generally about the contract and the way, the context of what I was saying about kind of the feeling that we needed to carry on with the investment. They weren't formal decision points, but it would be part of a management team discussion about it, and I would have been involved in those, but it wasn't a formal decision making.
Okay. Just something in respect of your personal responsibilities. You were supervising, among other things, the legal services. So what, if any, involvement did you have in the decisions the council took in respect of legal action in 2017 and 2018, given your line management?
I didn't directly get involved in any of those. There was a senior solicitor involved in that, who was extremely capable, competent, who I rely on their advice. It's interesting in retrospect when you think back about kind of what might have happened differently, because I now regret it. There's a point in which, because of the impetus and all the things I've described about the difficulty of the contractual arrangements, that if you look back, and I was part of this, there might well have been an element of what's called groupthink around this, around kind of we need to do this, there's an impetus behind this, we need to deliver it. And knowing all the people individually involved in giving that advice and taking those decisions, I trust them, I know they're doing a good job, I know they're trying to do their best. I would have placed reliance on them giving the right advice in the circumstances. I wouldn't have formally needed to get involved, but over time you kind of do wonder how much, in terms of those checks and balances and standing back, we were able to kind of think about, well, how's this going? What's happening here? In the context of all the difficulties we've got.
Yeah.
It's easy to think that now, I suppose.
Yeah.
But at the time, I would have placed reliance on it, and it's interesting seeing some of what the reaction to what we did going on. You know, I can see that people, you know, at various points think there's a conspiracy going off, or, you know, and none of that, just people honestly trying to take the best decision they could with a significant investment, with constraints. Whether that got into a place where kind of vision narrowed slightly, might be something as part of this process I and other people would say, well, perhaps we need to think about that for the future.
Right. Okay. I want to pick up one or two things you've said there in a minute, but just before I get into a little bit of follow-up on what you've just said, one more thing I just want to check, which is whether, from what you know, the council's decisions through the dispute were taken appropriately in the following sense, in the sense that decisions were taken at the appropriate level, that there was proper internal consultation up and down the chain, that established processes and rules were followed, that the delegation system, for example, between members and officers, was followed. As far as you're aware, were decisions taken properly in that sense, or were there circumstances where you weren't sure that processes were properly followed?
I thought about this. I have no reason to believe that they weren't followed. And actually, I've been here a few years, and knowing the way the council works and the people involved, if some of the people involved in giving advice on that had been concerned about inappropriateness, it would have got flagged. That's the way it works. That's what mine and other people's roles are, to have people involved in projects and issues, and when someone doing that has concerns, they go up my chain or another chain to go, hang on a minute, this isn't being handled in the right way. That wasn't the tone of what came out of that. So I have no reason to believe that those things were taken at the wrong level or taken inappropriately from the point of view of the role of members and officers. And from what I know, members and officers worked pretty closely on it throughout the period. I think what really didn't help again as well, and this is an interesting experience at the moment with the committee system, is that we have a contract which has got a lot of confidentiality clauses in because of the time it was done and the way it was seen, the role of banks. That leads to a perceived level of transparency problem externally, because there are various points where I asked a question we go, we can't answer that because of commercial confidentiality. That's not unusual for a lot of large contracts like that. That doesn't help. The delegated nature of decision making within the council linked to that, I can see how that leads to a perception that things are being done secretly, and that's difficult to deal with, because some things do have to be done in private, particularly with a large significant commercial contract. I think that's part of the issue, so there's some issues there about kind of how we deal with large contracts like that transparency in the future. So I think that contributed to a lot of it, but I don't have a reason to believe that things were done inappropriately. In the long history of working here, when things like that have happened, they get flagged up.
So, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but what I've understood from what you've said is you didn't see rules being broken, and had they been, someone would have flagged it. But that's not to say that people who weren't in the direct chain of decision making didn't have questions or reservations about whether the smartest decisions were being made.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, that gets me on to my next question, Eugene, which relates to essentially the system of checks and balances. And you talked about this a little bit earlier. In retrospect, what would be your commentary on how well or maybe not as well as would have been perfect, that system of checks and balances worked in the difficult period of the dispute.
Yeah, I think it probably comes back to what you just said about kind of when you look back, and it's interesting, isn't it, that where we are now and the successful and positive tree partnership we've got, which is, you know, a model for elsewhere now. So,
yes.
So how come we've got to the point where we've done that, and that's involving the kind of changes we need to make, and where we ended up there? I explained a lot of that about the context and the impetus, but I think there is an issue kind of that, you know, and thinking back on that around, and some of the reasons why we're now, you know, talking about having a committee system, which is that kind of perception of what's going off behind the mask is an issue that needs dealing with. And if we'd thought about it, I think we did, but at the start of the contract, hugely complex mechanism, we're making significant changes to the roads of Sheffield. In tree terms, what we're actually doing is, and been maintained properly for decades, it was bound to be disruptive. I suppose there's a kind of point about, in thinking through the risk of that, what did we do, should we do, and do we do now, and think about learning from that around, that's bound to have an impact on communities. Whenever we do anything in the city, there's never a case where we're making any decision where 100% of people are happy.
Yeah.
It's about finding always the least worst, that's the wrong term, but the thing where you kind of, you do enough consultation, discussion about what's happening, where you hear people, and on balance, and they're, you know, and to be fair, you know, elected members and officers have to make really difficult decisions at various points that are not popular and never going to be, but there is a way of doing that which mitigates the impact of that. And I think we have got quite a clunky contract mechanism, necessarily because of the nature of it, delivering speedy investment, and really the kind of community consultation side about what's impacting probably got a little bit lost. I think, thinking back to the time as well and what coloured a lot of that, if you think about it, it happened in certain parts of the city. And large parts of the city, this wasn't an issue. And actually, even in those parts that it's impacted, it was certain areas. It got out of proportion, I think. You know, the media reaction, which was very well used. I recall at the time kind of a lot of the kind of newspaper, The Guardian in particular, you know, and you get people commenting nationally as if you were living in a city where all the trees had been raised to the ground. But could we have avoided that? We've got a tree partnership now. What might have happened at the start about some of that, the way decisions, if decisions were taken not in the wrong way, how were they taken from the point of view of the kind of wider wisdom and the impact we're having, and thinking through whether there are other options and alternatives.
Yeah.
That's not formal checks and governance balances. That's a kind of broader, the groupthink term I use.
Yes.
What's the standing back?
Yes.
And internally and perhaps externally thinking about the wisdom and the right method of dealing with some of the contentious issues. Does that?
Yeah, no, that's extremely helpful, I think, in framing my next question, which is, you know, I'm interested in a couple of questions which essentially relate to why the dispute couldn't be resolved between basically late 2016 and early 2018, when it turned out it could be resolved from early 2018. And one question is whether there were discussions, maybe involving a broader group of people, including senior people, asking the question in late 2016, 2017, very beginning of 2018, do we think the strategy we have here, which is to plough ahead with the contract and to essentially keep going, notwithstanding the opposition that was being encountered, do we think that strategy is going to work? So that's one kind of question. A second kind of question is, again, and I'm sort of asking whether you were party to conversations where that question was asked, but also this question was asked. Are we sure that all of the things we're doing here, bearing in mind the council did some quite controversial things, particularly during the course of 2017, are we sure that this is the right way for us to be behaving? Do you remember any conversations, bearing in mind you weren't in the line management, and if it wasn't your direct responsibility, I just wonder if you remember any kind of conversations of that sort?
I can't remember the exact dates, but I think that there were, during that period, there were various attempts to try and deal with the issue in a mitigated way. So I'm remembering the point at which we set up the tree panel and we involved the chair of BAS in that to try and get some level of, there was some attempt to kind of get some external input to that and be seen to do it more transparently. And then the point at which the bishop got involved in mediation as well. So some of that did happen, and I was in some conversations, members and officers, kind of the cabinet meeting with the executive in private, where those things were discussed as a means of doing it. Yes. I'm just thinking about your last question. I'm not sure perhaps that they kind of got to that kind of point about kind of, somebody went, hang on a minute, is the fundamental approach right? During that period, those things were more about trying to find some way of mitigating, mollifying. What I recall from the period as well is I think things became quite entrenched.
Yeah.
And I don't just think from the council point of view either. Things became very confrontational. And that probably didn't help either way. And I think things dragged on because it became very polarised. A lot of the media and kind of protester narrative was around we're laying waste to the city. There was this kind of opposition where, we were kind of thinking, well, we're replacing the trees. They need replacing. But then the narrative that was out there was that we weren't replacing them and we were lying about that. And I think that context and that polarisation probably contributed to people becoming entrenched and it becoming more difficult for those attempts to work. And therefore made it a bit more difficult for us to kind of go, are we fundamentally wrong here? Because actually, I think largely the way it was playing out was wrong, but I don't think the fundamental decisions people thought they were doing felt wrong.
Right. So I suppose that gets me to the question of, and I recognise you weren't in the line management chain where the responsibility was on this point, but there is a question about why, when it proved possible to resolve the dispute in 2018, it had proved so problematic to resolve it in 2016 or 2017.
I think probably the cumulative impact of and the final recognition that it was entrenched. I think probably some personnel changes as well. From our point of view, in terms of some of the people involved in the contract who've gone through a period of moving on, other people getting involved, and then I remember at the point we did a proper review of, back to what you said earlier, about was there such an issue of we couldn't leave some of those trees or take measures.
Right.
And a report did come through to our management team, which was pretty clear that actually the information on which we based a lot of those decisions was flawed in some circumstances and could alternative actions come in. A lot of which, my recollection is that, again, there was an assessment of the state of the highways done right at the start of the contract about it is in this state, these are the reasons, this is what need doing, and I think that's what drove a lot of the impetus, whereas actually as it went out further on, more detailed investigations were done about certain parts of the network, but actually could have built around something.
Yes. And
that came out and that, so that emerged from, I think, that kind of cumulative kind of attrition, and also different people getting involved and a little bit more able to stand back and go, well, hang on a minute,
yes,
we need to take a look at this.
Okay, no, that's very helpful, thank you for that. More broadly, and again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and we don't, at the time it's different. But with the benefit of hindsight, and this is relevant to the part of my role which is helping you think about avoiding future problems, but with the benefit of hindsight, what do you think the council might have done differently?
I think I've alluded to it. I think recognising if we're doing... The trouble is, it was seen at the beginning as such a good news story about dealing with a pothole city, that, and then that led to the impetus about needing to do the investment. I think it's a recognition that even where you've got something like that, and I think we all know this, there's always going to be somebody upset, even if you're doing something that's great. And huge contract, doing a huge amount, there were bound to be elements. So following that through and taking a contractual approach to implementation is something you need to think about, and that's a learning point about anything like that. You cannot let contract mechanisms have that kind of impact on communities without thinking more broadly.
Right.
And some of the difficulty of this, without being rude to people, you've got people involved in implementing a contract from quite a technical background, and people who deal with tarmac and
Right.
and actually those services though do impact on communities, and thinking about how we properly wrap community engagement around that,
Yes.
particularly given the lack of flexibility we've got, and hopefully kind of that's what done in the right way this kind of hearings about. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but if it's used to kind of judge people who thought they were making decisions at the point time at the right time versus what's the learning from that we can take into other areas of what we're doing, some of which I think is in there in terms of the way we're working with the committee system, etc. It's about thinking through that community engagement and impacts.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your perspective on that. I think that's very some important things you said there. Now, there's been a substantial journey since 2018 in recovering and adopting a different approach, which you've outlined. But the council's also been dealing with some outstanding issues, including complaints, requests for information, other things, as if you like, the legacy of the dispute. Could you describe for us the sort of approach that, from your perspective, the council is taking to those sorts of outstanding issues?
Yeah. I think there's a bit of learning. There has been a recognition that kind of, I've already said about that kind of transparency and openness problem was there. That's what this process is about, hopefully. We've dealt with a huge number of freedom of information requests, kind of led to the tree archive, because part of the whole point here, isn't it, is kind of that thinking about, rather than sitting here dealing with hundreds of FOIs, it's much better to just publish what information you can, and then it's out there. There's been quite a lot of thinking about where we've got contracts like this, which have necessarily got some elements, and again, I think this is an issue other councils are dealing with. How far can you go about publishing details up front rather than ending up where we end up here with a hugely complex contract, which when people ask for it, we end up redacting parts of it because that's not how it was negotiated in the first place, and you can build things into other contracts where you think much more up front about, well, actually, we ought to work on the basis that somebody's going to ask to see this document, so can we build that into the process with the contract while we're signing it and the legal agreements so that we can be more transparent. So I think it has led to a lot around that and those kind of thinkings. I think we're still in a difficult position with that because the legacy of this, and hopefully this is where your inquiry comes in, is that a kind of breakdown of trust around that happens around that, is no matter how hard you try, and then other things have impacted them. For example, I know we've got various FOIs we struggle to do with because during COVID we had to kind of stop doing a lot of that work because people were doing elsewhere. So there's a kind of legacy of an ongoing kind of FOIs going on and questions being asked because of the breakdown in trust at the time that casts a long shadow.
Yes.
So hopefully with the things we're doing around that and trying to make that right and this inquiry, that's kind of where we can kind of set the record as straight as possible as openly, and then kind of stand back and do the learning from that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The contract obviously runs to 2037, and I just wonder, are there future risks that you're having to think about, or things that are on your mind that if they were to be crystallised might lead to a re-emergence of some of the problems you're in the process of escaping from. What's on your mind in terms of those future risks?
It's not a risk about kind of the implementation. I think it's more around what I already described. The current circumstance financially for local authorities is not going to get any better.
Yeah.
Facing another huge issue again next year. Social care continues to require increased investment.
Yeah.
The government, despite what it says, has done nothing to resolve that. It's only getting worse.
Yeah.
That's going to lead to some really difficult decisions next year, and I see no end in it. There's been no clarity from government about either the future of social care and its funding with local authorities, or how the vexed question of how local authorities can be properly funded in future. History is littered with various inquiries which have gone absolutely nowhere, and then we end up with a series of short-term fixes. So and again, this is not just us, but what we have a combination of circumstances of is, that with this and the waste contract, a couple of very fixed costs which were done for absolutely the right reason at the time, to get investment into services that needed it, energy to waste plants, dealing with issues around that, the investment in highways that was in at the time, a number of fixed costs that make the room for manoeuvre in the context of that circumstance that all local authorities have got very difficult. So we are bound in one way to another to get to a point where we will need to look at negotiating reductions to the contract. That will be hugely complex. It'll involve government, it'll involve AME, it'll involve banks. It's bound to lead to some reduction in service standards that will be contentious. So, I think it would be very important to kind of learn from this about how that's done. It still won't be easy.
Yeah.
So, thinking forward, it's a little bit difficult to see financial sustainability for most local authorities in the next 5 years, now mind 2037. But there is a risk there, absolutely.
Yes, and that will play into the contract and how you manage the streets and the highways and the pavements and the lighting and the trees in a way that doesn't lead to a re-emergence of things you're just moving beyond. I understand the point you made there. Thank you. So I've asked you lots of questions. Thank you very much for your candour and the detail of your answers, which I found helpful. Certainly in terms of understanding your perspective, which is an important one. Are there other things you would like to say before we close the session?
Just to reiterate what I said about, I hope this process kind of is something people can invest in and stand back from. Because at various times it's become a really heated issue, this. And as I said, kind of quite polarised, and polarising in the city. And a political football as well. And whilst, this is a political organisation, I think it's just really important for the kind of benefit of the whole city and its image, which I think, in various instances is quite unfairly tarnished externally. I said I used to get fed up of explaining to people in other cities that there were still trees in Sheffield. And kind of putting that behind us and learning the lessons from it, and that everybody's able to do that. So that's what I'm really hopeful the process can do,
Okay. No, thanks for that. And I hope that's what I can help with as well. And as you alluded to there was a reputational damage done to the city through this process, and recovering from that is valuable in multiple ways. And I hope that my inquiry can contribute, at least in a modest way, to that.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason I agreed to do this piece of work, because I'm interested in helping with the solution of public policy problems. That's what I've spent the whole of my life doing, and I think it's an interesting example.
Hope it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Could we stop the hearing?